Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of The Examined Life with Phil. This time I'm continuing on with the series I'm doing on science, creation, evolution, and the various controversies surrounding that. And I have back with me here on the podcast Dr. Peter Rasor, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at Grand Canyon University. You might recall months and months ago I had him on the program to talk about Molinism, but he's actually co-authored a book called Controversy of the Ages, Why Christians Should Not Be Divided Over the Age of the Earth, which is a very relevant book when we're talking about creation, evolution, and things like that. So I asked Peter if he'd like to come on and talk to me about the book, and he said, well, yes, of course, I'll talk to you about my book. How many philosophers don't like to talk about the books they write and the ideas they have? I still haven't met one. So.
Right.
So how are you doing this afternoon, Peter?
Doing great, Phil. Thanks for having me back on. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. And you also run a blog and a podcast that you told me you've kind of taken a step back from now. Isn't it called The Razor?
No, it's called The Blade, actually.
The Blade, excuse me. That's what it was, yeah.
Yeah, it is affiliated with my last name, so you got that particular point correct. Yeah, it's called The Blade. They're actually on two different websites. The blog is on thebladeonline.org. It's hosted by WordPress, and then my podcast is The Blade, and it is hosted by Podbean. And so they're on two different sites, so if anybody wants to look for those, just be aware of that. And what's interesting is I've taken sort of a sabbatical or a respite, a break from doing some of that. And the interesting thing for me is I keep getting these emails and updates saying that you've got new followers. So it's almost like I'm gaining more followers by not doing anything. So it's very interesting. I'm getting people reading some of my blog posts / articles, and then people listening to my podcast. So that's great. That's wonderful. I think it's neat. And again, I'll get back to it eventually. But sometimes life just hands you a bunch of different things to do. So.
Yeah. Then that's the one thing I actually haven't tried to get more followers to my podcast is just stop doing things and see what happens.
Just stop, and I guess all of a sudden they're interested. So. Yeah,
that rule about how you have to keep putting out more content apparently isn't true. So.
Yeah, I guess not.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention your podcast and blog because I thought that was so cool that you were able to tie it into your last name in such a clever way like that. And it actually makes me a little jealous and I wish I had a last name that I could do that with, because Kullberg doesn't really translate to anything philosophical or philosophical-like.
Right. Yeah, I thought about something with doing with Occam because of Razor, but I figured that would be a little too obvious. So I just did something that actually The Blade was actually a nickname given to me years ago when I was growing up. And so I decided to stick with that, to sort of resurrect it and use it for my blog and my podcast. So that's what I do.
Yeah, that's really cool. And, although you might get some copyright problems, you could even tie it into that Marvel character Blade who kills vampires too. So.
Yeah. What's interesting is when I first started to try to get a web address, I tried The Blade. I tried all sorts of different things. It took me forever to even get one because of that movie and and all the other things affiliated with it. So, but anyway.
Okay. Well, as much as I like that, I didn't bring you here to talk just about your podcast and blog, but to talk about this book that you've written called The Controversy of the Ages. So I guess my first question to you is what led you to writing this book? Because every time somebody writes a book, there's a little bit of a story behind it, why they thought it was important, how they got into it. So why don't you just tell us about that?
Well, I want to start by saying this was very much a collaborative effort with my co-author, and probably more so of a lead on his part. Let me basically explain that. Give a little bit of history on some of my interests. I've always been interested in philosophy and science. Those have apologetics type of issues. Those have always been something I've enjoyed since probably high school, and more so the older I've gotten, and then obviously going into getting my graduate work accomplished and getting my PhD in philosophy, it's really come to the fore, and I really enjoy it. And so, first of all, I already have a background and interest in that sort of topic. But then after I graduated my PhD in philosophy, my advisor, who is the co-author of this book, Ted Cable, he is a professor, I believe, of apologetics still at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky.
Okay.
It was about a year or so after I graduated. He was my advisor. He oversaw my dissertation process. He came to me and he said, "Look, I'm still having difficulty getting this book completed and getting it written and all the research done, etc." Because he had suffered and was still suffering some side effects from chemotherapy and some other things, because he still has blood of the cancer, or cancer of the blood, excuse me, said the opposite way there. And cancer of the blood, I don't know if anybody knows much about that. I don't remember the specific medical terminology there, but once you get it, you always have it. Eventually you will die of it. At least that's been the historical cases with it. And he's been able, by the grace of God, to find ways to stay alive, and really has no difficulties in regard to that for the most part. What he does have difficulties with, and I don't think he would mind me sharing this, is with a lot of concentration and focus issues. And they actually call it chemo brain. I don't know if anybody has heard that before, but they call it chemo brain. And it's acts kind of like ADHD sometimes. And so he was having difficulty getting all this material together, and he really wanted some help. And I said, he came to me and asked me, and I said, sure. I said, I'll help you out. So we spent a couple of years or so putting together research and some more stuff that he, in addition to what he had already completed. And I started writing a bunch of the initial chapters and putting that material together. And then eventually what happened is I ended up in 2015 taking a faculty position out here in Phoenix at Grand Canyon University. And so when that happened, I sort of had to transition and say, look, I'm not going to be able probably to help as much as I was, because we got together a lot personally, having coffee meetings and stuff like that, going over the book and everything. Obviously, I couldn't do that anymore, being about 1,700 miles away. And so he decided to take the reins and to finish it. And so that's basically how it came about, the interest in me doing it. And this was a project that he had in the works for several years and had been doing a lot of stuff on, had written some papers for the Evangelical Theological Society and all sorts of other things.
Yeah, he mentions a lot of that in the book, that he'd had in the works for a while, and the other essays he'd presented and things like that.
Yeah. And so a lot of this, I like to give credit where credit is due. I think this was basically his baby to begin with. And because of a lot of the medical issues he had, he brought me on. And certainly, I had a lot of input and did a lot of things, but I like to think of this as his baby, because this was his lifelong passion. And I'm sure if he had the abilities to write even more on it, he probably would. But I think he's happy, and I'm happy that he was able to really finally get this book out with his name on it. And of course, I'm happy too that I was able to do all the work that I did for him in this collaborative effort. So,
okay, fantastic. And so, I'm assuming when he came and brought you on, part of the reason you did it was not just to be kind, but because you also saw a lot of value in the project. Is that
absolutely,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things. I used to be kind of a dogmatic young Earth creationist. Didn't really study it a whole lot, but I was very much similar to Ted Cable, the co-author, in that, he explains this a little bit in the book, that he was a young Earth kind of guy in his early years, just as myself, and primarily due to the influence of Answers in Genesis, because their PR and their materials are very pervasive. They're very effective at that type of a thing. And most people, actually, I would probably argue, and at least make a good case, that that's primarily what people are familiar with, is the young Earth creationist perspective, because of how well AIG and people like them have been able to get their message out, whether it's social media, and before social media, we're talking like 80s and early 90s. They did a fantastic job of being able to write books and get them to the hands of church lay people and all sorts of things. And so I came across that stuff too when I was younger and sold on that. And I thought that was the only perspective. And of course, one of the things that Ted Cable and I saw that was troubling and why we thought the work was very important is because you basically get from that perspective, the AIG perspective in particular, that any other view is atheistic. Any other view is anti-Christian. Any other view does not take the Bible seriously. Any other view does not accept Scripture, and so you're suspect. You're sort of this liberal theologian or something. And of course, Dr. Cable, being a more seasoned person than I am, and being a faculty member and being involved with this type of stuff a lot longer than I have been, he knew other Christians who did not take the young earth proposal or idea. Instead, they believed in old earth creationism. And he's like, these guys are defenders of biblical inerrancy. You mentioned before the podcast here with me about how you're going to have a series on inerrancy and stuff, or talking with somebody on their podcast about that. And it's so interesting that the perspective was that, hey, if you don't accept a young earth creationist position, well, then you don't believe in inerrancy, you don't believe in inspiration of Scripture, you don't believe in authority. And we saw that as a huge problem. And saying things like, the age of the earth is a gospel issue. The age of the earth is sort of this litmus test of whether or not you're really a true biblical Christian. And of course, Cable and I, we saw that as very problematic because here we have other Christians we know who took a different view, and they were much defenders of Scripture. They weren't liberal theologians at all. Yeah. And interestingly enough, as a couple of our chapters point out, and even as we sort of pepper it throughout the book, go back in history during the liberal and fundamentalist controversy, or the modern fundamentalist controversy, late 1800s, early 1900s, these theologians, major theologians, not like B.B. Warfield, Charles Hodge, and some others, the old Princetonians, the ones who led this whole movement on defending Scripture and making it our authority against the liberal position, theological position, they were all old earth creationists. They didn't adopt the young earth view. And so, when I first came into contact with this sort of spun my world around, right? Yeah. Because I was totally sold on the young earth position, being highly influenced by AIG and other organizations like them. ICR would be another one, the Institute of Creation Research. And then when I came into contact with these other theologians who were very conservative, and in fact, we know later some of them had to go off and start Westminster Seminary because Princeton gets taken over by liberal theologians in 1927 to 1929 period. And so I really had to take a look at this issue. I'm like, yeah, well, obviously they take Scripture seriously, so how did they get to that conclusion? There are other options out there. And to start painting it as if you're suspect in your theology as a Christian, and one who believes in the Bible takes the authority of it seriously because you don't believe in the young earth, I thought, well, that can't be right. There's something wrong there. And of course, Cable saw that years before I did, being involved with this controversy much longer than I had been, and before I even got involved, and even went to graduate school for that matter. So that is really the reason why I think this is an important book, because as the subtitle says, I don't think Christians should divide over the age of the earth. It's kind of funny as I sit there and think about it just for a minute. We're saying, some people would argue that we should divide over the age of the earth. Really? We're going to divide as Christians over how old the earth is. In a sort of funny, comical way, I like to say it this way. Really, we're going to divide over how old a rock is.
Yeah, literally.
I mean, really, that's what we're going to be doing from those who argue that we need to divide over this. Really, we're going to divide over how old a rock is. We as Christians, don't we have bigger fish to fry?
Hope so, yeah.
So that's really the impetus, I think, behind the reason for writing the book and why I got interested from a theological standpoint is, there's bigger fish to fry. There's better things to divide over than whether or not, the earth is 10 billion years old or 6,000 years old or something like that.
Yeah. I think that seems like a pretty good summation of the book. I read the book before I'm talking to you here because I have this weird idea in my head. It's kind of important to read what people say before you talk to them about it.
That's probably a good idea.
Yeah. I can recall in college, when I was in college, there was controversy over that book called The Shack, that novel, which I'm sure you've heard about.
Oh, yeah.
And so the school, to their credit, tried to hold like a discussion thing where they had a couple theology professors there talking about the book. Good idea.
Mm-hmm.
90% of the people there talking about the book hadn't read the book. It was like me and 3 other people who had actually read the book. And I was thinking, what you people haven't even read the book. How do you have a leg to stand on to talk about it? And even like people who were praising it, saying it was so wonderful, would say, I haven't read the book. Here's what's right about it. I haven't read the book. Here's what's wrong about it. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about if you haven't even read the book? That's so ridiculous. So
yeah, it sounds like some of my students where they will have some sort of opinion that they're trying to argue, but they hadn't even read the material for the class. You haven't read the text. You haven't read these other articles that we supplied. And here you are arguing for some sort of position in a dogmatic fashion. And if you had just read, you would actually find out that that particular statement you just said was addressed and either shown to be false or true or whatever the case may be. So, yeah, it is very interesting how we can take some sort of official dogmatic approach and opinion to something and we're not even informed. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which kind of ties back in with some of the issues surrounding this book. So, based on what you were saying there, one thought that I had, and I guess this isn't in the notes I sent you because it just came to me, is it seems to, at least from the observations I've had, and you've obviously done a lot more research into this than I, so you tell me if I'm wrong, it seems very much like the idea that the age of the earth is something we should divide over is coming from only the direction of the people who are young earth creationists. Now, it could well be that there's a theistic evolutionist, an old earth creationist, an ID proponent or something out there who's saying that, but I haven't heard them. Does that fit with your research as well, or?
I think by and large, if we're going to stereotype or come up with a generalization, I think you're correct.
Mm-hmm.
I think by and large, the ones who argue that we need to divide over this issue or that it's a gospel issue or something like that, a biblical issue, and that it can somehow snowball into collapsing other important Christian doctrines, that is primarily coming from the young earth creationist perspective. That is what a lot of them will argue. You rarely hear that from any other position. You definitely don't hear that from the theistic evolutionary perspective. Rather, they're going to argue something else, which I can mention in a moment. But then your old earth creationist perspective, which is very, very large within the evangelical community, conservative Christians, who believe in inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture, they won't argue that either. You get sort of a jab once in a while from maybe someone like a Hugh Ross with Reasons to Believe toward the young earth creationists, but he won't say things like, you don't believe in Scripture if you believe this view, or you're not really a true Christian if you take this view. You get that from young earth creationists mostly, from what I have seen, and I'm trying to be as fair as I can here. Because I know young earth, this is just the way it is, unfortunately, and I hesitate to even say this, but it's just a fact of the matter. Your young earth creationists, they're very sensitive on this issue. A lot of them are, not all of them, and I don't want to paint a broad stroke here, but a lot of them are. Some aren't, and I appreciate those people who aren't as sensitive, but those who are very sensitive, just about any kind of critique or any kind of discussion you may have about the young earth creationist perspective, just me even saying this right now could cause a huge storm of negative comments and diatribes and all sorts of criticisms toward me. And my point is, as Cable and I point out in the book, is I'm not trying to be mean here. I'm just stating what I've observed. I'm just stating, a lot of young earth creationists, this is their perspective, and they get pretty hot when it comes to questioning whether or not Genesis 1, the word day means 24 hour period or a long length of time or something else. I mean, they're very sensitive on that. A lot of them are. Now, again, not all of them. I want to make sure it's very clear. Not all of them. And some of them are very courteous and very respectful and have great dialogue with. But there's a lot who aren't. And that particular criticism is usually coming out of the young Earth creationist camp.
Yeah, and I'll echo what you're saying, that not all of them are. Like, my dad's a pastor in the Assemblies of God, and he's a young Earth creationist, and I'm not. And he and I have talked about this, and we've had good conversations where neither of us is yelling at the other. You're not taking Scripture seriously. You're not a Christian or something. He still thinks I'm wrong, and I still think he's wrong, but he's still my dad. We hang out. We're both Christians, so no problem there. So it doesn't have to be that way, at least.
Yeah, exactly. And I would agree with that. And, you know, we come out in the book and state very clearly toward the end in the last couple chapters, Cable and I, we are against theistic evolution. We think that's very problematic. Basically, theistic evolution and how I see it, I know there's a lot of nuances in it and everything, but at the risk of sounding simplistic and reductionistic, my viewpoint is that theistic evolution is basically taking the whole entire Darwinian evolutionary paradigm and just tacking God on it and saying God did it. And I disagree with that perspective. I think there's a lot of problems with Darwinian evolution. Stephen Meyer's got 3 great books out on that now, or at least will by next April have a 3rd great book out on it. Even philosopher from Biola University, J.P. Moreland, he's got a great book out on theistic evolution. It has, you know, a compendium of a bunch of different compilations, of authors writing what's wrong with theistic evolution. And I agree with that perspective. I think there is huge problems with theistic evolution. But at the same time, I'm not going to sit here and look you in the eye, Phil, and say that you cannot be a Christian and a theistic evolutionist. I think that's ridiculous, you know. I think that's over the top. I think that goes too far. Now, do I think you have some issues and some things that need to be worked out? Absolutely. Absolutely I do. But I'm not going to sit here and say, well, you don't take Scripture seriously. You're not a Christian or what. You know, no, I don't. I'm not going to do that. I strongly disagree with it. I'd much rather see someone be a young Earth creationist than a theistic evolutionist. But at the end of the day, you're all Christian. All right. And I don't think we need to divide over this particular issue. So that's really sort of the approach that I try to take, and also Cable. So. Yeah.
And that's you guys outline that approach in the book, so I've actually got something. We'll get to that later. The other question I have, and this is one where if you don't feel comfortable answering it, I think that's fine. But did you and Dr. Cable disagree about any of the issues when you were writing the book? Like, was there a case where you argued one way, he argued another way, or something along those lines? I just find that an interesting thing when you've got a co-authored book there. So.
Well, what's interesting is when he first brought me onto the project, I was actually sort of on the fence, working through some of these issues, not really knowing which way I lean, whether young Earth or old Earth. And actually, to be more accurate, at the time I was probably still leaning toward young Earth, but I didn't have a strong grip on it like I used to. And of course, that was already at the tail end of my studies and PhD in philosophy and all that sort of a thing. So I was able to broach that in my studies and look more deeply into it. But since it wasn't obviously a major focus of my dissertation or my studies of my program, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on it, but just enough to be able to say, you know, well, maybe there's some issues here, you know. And so I'm open to old Earth. And the more I studied and the more I did some research for Cable and we worked on this project together, the more I was letting go of young Earth creationism, because I'm this stuff just doesn't hold a whole lot of water here and there. Now, that being said, if you're going to push me in a corner and you're going to say, so how old is the Earth? I'm going to be a lot like Dr. Cable. I'm going to say, I don't really know. I don't care. You know? So today I would say I lean more old Earth. But, you know, if you're going to, like I said, if you're really going to push me to take a definitive position, I'm going to say, look, I'm not going to, because there's problems everywhere, you know. There's holes in the old Earth creationist perspective from a biblical perspective, as well as a philosophical perspective and scientific perspective. But it's that way with all the views, in my opinion. And so that's where I go. And so with Cable Line, when we worked on this project, Maybe at the beginning we would have had some different opinions and stuff, but he's so ironic in tone, and me too, that we work very well together.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that kind of actually goes back to my beginning of my studies with my PhD program when he became my advisor. The reason why he became my advisor is because our relationship clicked so well.
Okay, good deal.
Yeah, I mean, we just got along very well, and so I ended up asking him at the end of my THM, hey, I'm going to get my PhD in philosophy. Would you mind serving as my chair? And he said, oh, sure, I'd do that, because we got along so well. And so we really just had a good relationship from the beginning. And so even if we did disagree, I don't remember any kind of, knockdown, drag out fights.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
If there was ever a question, my approach was always, okay, you're the seasoned veteran here in regard to this issue. I'm going to sort of bow to you and say, I'll consider that if I disagree or something,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's sort of always my approach, or at least one I try to take these days. Maybe back in my early years, I didn't. I think probably freshmen in college, they think they know everything, right? We go through that. But the older we get, the more we, but the older we get, the more we study, the more we realize, maybe that person knows something I don't, because they're like 60, 70, 80 years old, and I'm only like 20 or 30 or 40, and so I'll listen to that person and I'll try to give benefit of the doubt. So
yeah, and I really liked how you put it there, that there's problems no matter what viewpoint you take, and I would just philosophically, generally, I actually extend that even beyond these issues and say that's pretty much the case with every position you can take as a human being on anything.
Absolutely.
When somebody says something like, there's no debate on this, I'm like, no, that just shows me you're being difficult, you're going through that freshman in college phase where you think you know everything. There's debates on everything. And I've even got my dad, when I've been discussing this issue with him, to agree with me, saying, yeah, no matter what position you take, you're going to have some problems that you need to work through. You're going to have issues that present themselves. There's difficulties everywhere. And so if you're willing to stake your camp somewhere, be honest enough to own up to the difficulties and try and find a way to work through them. So
yeah, exactly right. And I think at the end of the day, you've got to ask yourself, if you're going to take a young Earth creationist perspective or old Earth creationist perspective, which I believe are the most viable, you're going to have to ask yourself, where's the trade-off that you want to approach? Which thing are you willing to put up with in regard to your perspective? And ultimately that's what I think it comes down to, because there is something very challenging within each of those perspectives, as well as theistic evolution, if we're going to include all of them here. And you have to be able to answer that in some way, shape, or form, or at least be able to say, look, I'm not sure how to answer that, but I'm willing to put up with it. It isn't, to put in sort of an Alvin Plantinga terminology, it's not a defeater for me,
Yeah. So, but at the same time, you could be reasonable enough to say, but I can see how to another person that might keep them away from my view. It looks like a reasonable enough objection. It's not a dumb objection like when somebody claims, well, if God exists, who created God? Yeah,
that's in my opinion, a silly. But you're right. There, and I think since we're talking about the issue, I'd be probably the most open, I think, on this, and saying, look, one of the biggest issues with old Earth creationism is, what do you do with sin? What do you do with even what we call natural evil? Because obviously, if we have old Earth creationism being true, we have at least natural evil occurring before the fall, And I'm willing to admit, that's an interesting issue. I don't know how to exactly solve that. I have some ideas. But for me, at this stage of my life anyway, it's not a defeater for me. It doesn't break old Earth creationism for me. And because I think there are some reasonable explanations or responses to that. Now, for the young Earth creationist perspective, that's a huge deal. That would break it for them. And so they're unwilling to go the old Earth creationist, a lot of them, because of that particular point. I can understand that. Okay. I can kind of see that. But for me and my studies and what I've done over the years, that's not a huge issue for me anymore. It's just there's just so much other information and evidence and reasons to believe in old Earth creation that, to me, it makes more sense to at least lean that way rather than the young Earth position. And so it doesn't break the deal for me.
Yeah. Okay.
But I can at least see why that is an issue. I totally understand that.
You're following Aristotle's maximum. It's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain an idea without accepting it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
My wife and I were on vacation a while back, and I bought a bunch of new shirts for the vacation. And one of them, I put that Aristotle quote on because I wanted people to talk to me about it, but nobody did. So.
Oh well, maybe next time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I like that. I think that's all very good opening discussions. In fact, we're like almost halfway through already, so maybe I should move on to some more specific content of the book.
Sure, we can go as long as we need to. I think I'm good, so.
Okay, fantastic. So the first thing I noticed when I was going through the book, and I almost wanted to refer to this in a joking way, like you said, you laid out the position you and Dr. Cable will take at the end of the book, and my thought was, well, you buried the lead, man. We want to know what you think right at the beginning, because you spent, I'd say, probably 70 or 80% of the book laying down the history, both of supposed conflicts between science and religion, and of the history of these various movements, especially old Earth creation and young Earth creation, because theistic evolution is a bit younger of a movement, so it doesn't have quite as well established a history. But I thought that was that's a very different approach from what I've read of a lot of people who argue about these issues. So what led you to going that route of saying, hey, let's look back at possible conflicts with Galileo and Copernicus, compare what people were doing then to what's going on now, what went on with Darwin. So what was it that led you to take that route?
Well, I tell you what, that was done intentionally. We really were even somewhat reluctant toward the end of the book to even mention we lean toward old Earth. But, I think that does credit to the book, at least at some point. But I think it also shows, leaving it to the end, that is, of the intent behind it. If we think about it for a minute, the subtitle of the book is Why Christians Shouldn't Divide Over the Age of the Earth. Well, that's our point. So why should we sit here and slice and dice all these things about the old Earth creationist viewpoint? Our point isn't to try to persuade you to believe in old Earth creationism and disparage young Earth creationism. We wanted this to be very ironic in tone. We wanted to say, look, this is what we need to do as objective thinkers, as best as we can, as objective thinkers, when we look at the history of science and Bible issues. There have always been this back and forth between science and theology, or science and the Bible. And there are two major areas, at least, in the history of science and theology where this sort of war came up. Now, we don't think there's this ongoing war as such. We talk about the Draper-White thesis there in the first couple of chapters. And we think that's false. We don't think there's this continual war. But there have been at least two major times in the history of philosophy, science, and theology where there has been sort of this, okay, what do we do? We have this interpretation of Scripture that we've held for a long time, and now we have some scientific evidence and things going on in science that challenge our perspective of that particular biblical interpretation. Now, what do we do? And of course, the first one that comes to mind, if we know anything about the history and philosophy of science, is the Copernican revolution. So you have from the time of Aristotle all the way up until the 1500s or so, Galileo, Copernicus, and all these guys, Kepler, we have not just the Bible interpreters or theologians saying that Scripture teaches that geocentrism is true, that the Earth is the center of the universe, but we even have Aristotle and scientists. I mean, Ptolemy, for crying out loud, that was the major accepted scientific paradigm of all those thousands of years. So we have science as well as Christian faith, theology, saying, look, the Earth is the center, not the sun. To say anything otherwise is not only impious, but it's unscientific. But then here we have Copernicus comes along, right? And then his work on the celestial spheres, or however you want to translate his particular title of his work, it's published posthumously, after his death, that actually the sun should be considered the center and everything revolves around the sun. That was huge, and then Galileo comes along, and then you got Kepler, and then Brahe, and all these other guys. So here we actually have some sort of controversy of science and theology, and we can learn something from that. And one of the things that we can learn from that particular controversy is, especially Galileo, is that, look, he even specifically states he believes in biblical inerrancy. He says specifically in some of his letters, the Bible does not err. What might err is our interpretation of Scripture. And so that's the problem. And I think he's right. Whenever we have these kinds of controversies of even today, I think it's applicable to the question of the age of the earth. We old earth creationists, at least, I can say that because that's more my camp. That's the way I lean. I'm not questioning the inerrancy and inspiration of Scripture. I'm not questioning it at all. I'm questioning my interpretation of Scripture. And that's a totally different question. That's a totally different issue. If I'm questioning my interpretation, what I am saying is that really what Moses meant when he wrote that? Is that what really the author meant when he wrote that? Or am I misunderstanding it and I'm interpreting it rather through my own cultural and scientific paradigm of my time, and that's what had been done for thousands of years with scriptures that talked about the earth not moving. And so they said, well, that means that, geocentrism is true and all that sort of a thing. But what can we learn from that movement? We can learn that, look, science sometimes can help us understand Scripture better and interpret it more properly. And of course, today, how many people would honestly look at a lot of the Psalms and some of the other places where it says, God has established the earth and its pillars and it shall not be moved? How many of us today would interpret that and say, well, that's geocentrism? No, we don't interpret it that way at all. Rather, we interpret it in some metaphorical way. We interpret it in some sort of linguistic way, some sort of trope. We don't take it in a wooden literalistically sense, saying that, the earth doesn't move and geocentrism is true. We don't interpret it that way anymore. Rather, why? Why is the question we don't interpret that? Well, it's because science, through the study of Copernicus and Galileo, and of course now we have all of our telescopes and everything, and it's, contrary to your internet geocentrist, right?
Yes.
Geocentrism is false. Heliocentrism is true. We know that the Earth is not the center. The Earth revolves around the sun instead, and so on and so forth with the other planets and things along those lines. So, that particular argument is very important as we consider the age of the Earth argument, because at least we old Earth creationists are doing the same thing. We're looking at Genesis 1, and we're saying, okay, historically we've always interpreted this, at least for the most part. There are some exceptions, like Augustine and some others, where we look at the word day in Genesis 1, and we've sort of just assumed, well, that means a 24-hour period, 7 days. It took them 6 literal days, and now we're in the 7th day, which is an interesting thing in itself, of creation, right? We take that to be 6 literal days and to correspond to our 6 days of the week. But now, because we do have scientific evidence and other arguments saying, it looks like the Earth may be older than that. And now we have evidence astronomically that looks like the universe is even older than what we would think. And so now we're using that data and saying, well, maybe I'm misunderstanding the purpose of Genesis 1. Is it intended to actually teach some sort of scientific truth that it took 6 literal 24-hour periods of time, 6 literal days for God to create? Or is it intended to do something else?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we misinterpreted, the foundations of the earth not being moved. Maybe we're doing the same thing here. Maybe we're misinterpreting this. That's a far different issue than saying, oh, Scripture's wrong. We don't believe what it says. No, we believe what it says. We're just asking, what does it mean? Right?
Exactly.
And I want to know what it means. I don't want to be wrong like the Copernicans and, prior Copernicus and prior Galileo. I want to make sure I understand the Scriptures as best as I can in the right way. But unfortunately, from my perspective anyway, my opinion is that a lot of young Earth creationists don't understand that particular point.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at the interpretation. I'm not saying the Bible's wrong. I'm not saying I know better or that somehow I'm enlightened and now we just got to throw away all this stuff. No, we're not saying that at all. And in fact, if you remember, there's a couple of places in the book that Cable and I say, look, if you're a young Earth creationist and you're convinced that the Scripture teaches this, you don't have to give that up. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
If you're uncomfortable giving it up because it looks like maybe unbelieving science, right, quotation marks, is somehow trying to persuade you and thrust you into a different interpretation, don't accept it because of that. That's the wrong reason to accept it.
Mm-hmm.
Accept it because you're convinced that you've interpreted it wrong and that you're misunderstanding what Scripture intent is, the authorial intent. That's why you should reinterpret it. You shouldn't reinterpret it just because someone else says so, right? Or just because some authority in science says so. This is something that you have to look into. You have to research. You have to dig deep and then come to your own conclusions. You just don't throw something out that we've all have accepted for thousands of years just because someone says so.
Yeah. And I would say, in doing that, maybe scientific data like geology and things like that can come into play. Like I would say that's comparable to, I've had times in my life where I was pretty convinced God told me something where I was like, if God said, if you do this, this will happen, or something similar to that. And then I did, and it didn't happen. And my reaction wasn't immediately, I got to throw the whole thing out. It was, I guess that wasn't God. I misinterpreted, or there was something went wrong in the process.
Right.
And it was actual data I was seeing and observing that I was then feeding back in to say, I must have got the interpretation wrong somewhere. Maybe that was my own mind and it wasn't God, or something along those lines, which I would think is principally the same with this, where if you see, and I know young Earth creationists would dispute this, but if you see overwhelming evidence that the Earth is like 2 or 3 billion years old, which is what the geologists nowadays claim, then that should probably prompt you to look at your interpretation of Genesis and go, well, maybe I got this wrong.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting here, Phil, and this is somewhat of a small point, but it is very significant. It's interesting that the question of the age of the Earth did not arise with Darwin.
Yes, you make that point in the book too. Yeah,
but that is always the impression and the argument you get from some, let me underline that again, from some young Earth creationists. They will say, well, you're just trying to accommodate unbelieving evolutionary science. You're just trying to be accepted by the majority view today, and you're afraid to look different or believe differently than, the science of the day and all that sort of thing. Well, here's what's interesting. As I just mentioned, the whole question of old Earth came 200 years before Darwin even published his book. He wasn't even alive. So it wasn't Darwinism at all that led to the idea to reinterpret Scripture in an old age perspective. Rather, what brought it up was the discovery of fossils and seeing the strata of the Earth and realizing, you know what? We don't know where these fossils, these animals came from. These things are freaking huge, and they're in so many strata down. Today we call it the oh shoot! So I skipped my head. It's getting out of my brain here. What's that strata? The explosion they call it?
Oh, the Cambrian explosion.
Cambrian explosion, especially. Yeah. When they see the strata, the Cambrian strata, we look at that now and we're like, oh my goodness, what happened? Because before that, there's basically just microbes and nothing, right?
Very simple.
Very
life,
simple type of life, nothing too huge or complex. And we know now that this is, at least with how we do science today, billions of years ago. That's what led to this idea that the Earth must be billions of years, not because of Darwin. That's like 200 years in the future still. He's again, like I said, he hadn't even been born. And so to somehow claim that old Earth creationists, or even theistic evolutionists for that matter, are trying to just capitulate to Darwinian or evolutionary science is entirely entirely false. It's anachronistic. It doesn't take historically what really happened. What really led to this is the geological discoveries, not anything to do with Darwin.
Yeah, that reminds me of a point you guys make early in the book, that you say the history between science and religion is complex, but not conflicted with the, and I think you even will say with maybe the possible exception of the Copernican thing in Darwin, but those are the only two possible exceptions. Yeah. And the quote I pulled from the book about this, where I thought this just demonstrates it so well, is it was, you guys were citing a poll and you said evangelicals are likely to reject evolution, with 57% believing humans and other living beings have always existed in their present form. And now I read that and I think this just shows how many complexities are involved and how carelessly it's generally treated, because in a literal statement, even if you're a young earth creationist, if you take it literally, this statement is absolutely false, because we can prove just through archaeology that human beings are now significantly taller than they used to be. Now, that's probably not how most people who were reading the question actually read it, but the fact that you can interpret it in multiple different ways like that shows just how complex the issues are and how carelessly they're often treated.
Yeah, I mean, the word evolution in of itself is slippery. I mean, we can mean, I don't know, a whole dozen things, and what that means, right? I mean, are we talking about a common ancestry? Are we talking about changes within a species? Are we talking about natural selection? Are we talking about Darwin? Are we talking about something else? I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on, It's not easy. It's complex. And you're right, that specific statistic that you share, when you read that, if you read it absolutely literally and take it at its one-for-one face value, even your young earth creationists would disagree with it and say it's false, because they believe in natural selection. I mean, even Ken Ham does, for crying out loud, right?
I think he thinks all species of dog descended from two dogs that were on the ark, which my dog is definitely quite a bit different than whatever those two dogs on the ark would have been then.
Right. So. Yeah, exactly. And even a lot of young earth creationists will argue that all your dog types spawned from some sort of just one dog type. And when I say dog types here, I'm talking about foxes, wolves, coyotes, your domesticated dogs, and throw the whole dog whatever in there. And a lot of your young earth creationists are going to argue, well, that actually evolved, and they'll use that word, from one dog kind, as they would say, that Genesis 1 would refer to with the word kind there. So so even that particular question that you just read for us, young earth creationists have to say, well, that's false.
Yeah. It just shows the complexities involved, because that means some young earth creationists believe in common ancestry of a type to a point, because all current dog types would share that common ancestor. They then just wouldn't say, well, all dog types and all lizards share a common ancestor, like most proponents of Darwin evolutionary theory would propose. Okay, that's where I decided to break up Peter and I's conversation. It went about an hour and a half talking about the book, so I'll air the second part of that next week. In the meantime, before I wrap up the program this week, I want to do another episode of Calvin and Hobbes in philosophy, and I found one that I think is pretty relevant to this part of Peter and I's discussion. So, Calvin is once again sitting in his room at his desk doing homework, and he's talking to Hobbes. And he says to Hobbes, "Mom said I can't go outside until I finish my homework. If you'll help me, it'll be done faster. What's 5 plus 7? Hobbes, his eyes look up at the ceiling. He's got his hand on his mouth. He's thinking. He says, "I don't know." Calvin holds up the paper and says, "I don't know. I don't either." Hobbes points down at the paper and says, "Then write, 'I don't know.'" Calvin says, "Hey, that's a true answer, isn't it? I can write that for all of these. We're done." And the last panel shows Calvin and Hobbes bounding out the door outside to go play, and someone from inside the house, assuming probably his mom, is saying, "We'd better have a look at our progeny's homework." So, the point here, why it's funny, is that it's true in many senses that Calvin doesn't know the answer to those homework problems, but he has a prerogative to actually try and find out. And that's a distinction that's appropriate when we're talking about things like the age of the earth and creation and evolution. Peter made a comment in this segment that he's fine saying that he doesn't know what the age of the earth is. And I think if you're going to go in a very specific sense, that's perfectly appropriate. It's perfectly appropriate to say, well, is it 2.9 billion years old or 3.1 billion years old? And it's perfectly appropriate for you to turn around and say, well, I don't really know. And it could be either, because that distinction of it'd be 200 million years, so it's a lot. But the distinction between 2.9 billion years and 3.1, it's highly unlikely that distinction isn't going to any way affect any important beliefs in your life as far as your philosophical and theological beliefs and stuff. Like, he also mentioned that old Earth creationists have a problem to face up, that it seems like natural evil would have been occurring before the fall. Well, you're going to have that problem whether or not you're talking about a 2.9 billion year old Earth or a 3.1 billion year old Earth. And my figures might be a little off. It's been a little while since I looked up what the current geological theories on the formation of the Earth are, so I might be a little off on the numbers there. But I'm sure you can see the point. As far as how it affects the other beliefs in your life, kind of a distinction without a difference. But I think on the other hand, and I don't think Peter was being disingenuous when he said this, so I'm not accusing him of that. On the other hand, I think if you're going to say, well, I don't know if the world is 6 to 10,000 years old or 3 billion years old, well, then you're kind of pushing it a little bit, because that actually should have some reasonable effect on what you think about many important philosophical and theological issues, because you're going to have a radically different understanding of human origins and the origins of the Earth and things along those lines if you think the world is 6 to 10,000 years old than you do if you think it's 3 or 2.9 billion years old or something along those lines. And this comic also alludes to quite a few very important issues in epistemology, and maybe that's a segment I should do in the future, a whole thing on epistemology, which is questions of, well, how do you know things and what does it mean that you know? Because you can know things and still not be certain of them. Like myself, I think I know that the Earth is approximately 2 or 3 some odd billion years old, but I don't know that with certainty. I mean, I wasn't there, I didn't see it happening, like I'm now sitting in a chair talking to the microphone doing the podcast. I'm certain that I'm talking to the microphone doing the podcast, about as certain as you can be of anything. I'm much, much less certain of the age of the Earth than I am of the fact that I'm doing the podcast right now, and that just seems perfectly obvious. But I can still say in many senses, I know that. I know it in virtue of all the geological evidence in favor of that. I know it in virtue of the fact that it fits with many other theories like plate tectonics and things along those lines. I know it in virtue of the fact that I don't see conflict between that belief and my belief as a Christian in the inerrancy of Scripture in the first couple of chapters of Genesis, and so on and so forth. But I'm sure you can see it's just reasonable for me to say, well, I'm not as certain of that as I am of many, many other things. And as Peter alluded to, it really wouldn't be that big of a deal if it turned out the world was only like 500 million years old instead of 3 billion years old as far as my beliefs go. That wouldn't really shake things up in a great deal. So what I think we can take from the lesson here is Calvin is clearly being disingenuous when he says, I don't know. Because in one sense it's true, but he has a moral responsibility there to figure it out. And I don't think we have a moral responsibility to figure out the age of the Earth in the sense of, well, is it 2.9 or 3.1 billion years old? Or is it 6,000 years old versus 10,000 years old or something like that? But I do think, in a certain sense, you kind of have a moral responsibility to at least say which one you think is more likely, because that in turn has effects on many other beliefs that are about important things, like the origin of humanity, the origin of the Earth, how you would view the fall of mankind, if you even think there was one, as I know some theistic evolutionists don't really think there literally was one. Michael Jones, who I had on as a proponent of theistic evolution, he actually does believe in a literal Adam and Eve and a literal fall and things like that. But many theistic evolutionists don't. They think it's like a mythological story that didn't literally happen. And good on Michael for actually believing it literally, unlike many other people who take that position. And so that's my point here is, you can say I don't know what the age of the Earth is if you're going for very exact senses, but I do think you kind of have a moral imperative to try to at least say, I think this side is more likely than the other. because it's going to affect so many other beliefs of yours that are very, very important. And so, as usual, the lesson we take from Calvin and Hobbes is, don't be like Calvin. Okay, so that's the end of this week's episode. As I said, I'll be back next week with part 2 of Peter and I's discussion on his book. And just, as always, write in and let me know what you think. You can reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com or log into the Facebook group, The Examined Life with Phil. Just do a search for that. You'll find it. You can leave comments there. I try and post interesting things throughout the week that are funny or philosophically interesting or relevant. So if you like that kind of thing, find the Facebook group and follow me there. I mentioned a few weeks back that I'm going to do a debate on inerrancy with a gentleman who lives nearby here, and we're working on setting up the details on that. It's going to happen sometime in the next month or two in the area around Springfield, Missouri. So I'll mention more details as they come out. He and I have met and talked about how we're going to do the debate and stuff over coffee. He's a very agreeable guy, so even though we disagree on some details of how inerrancy works, we'll be able to have a very, I think, courteous and useful dialogue and exchange that should be helpful and edifying for everybody who listens. So I'm very, very excited about doing that. We're hoping we can get a live venue where people can listen in. That would be very good if we could do that. So there's a Facebook event page for that I'll link to on the Facebook page, and we'll post more details on as they come up on that. And of course, I'll let you know here on the podcast more details as they come up as well. So that's it for this week, and again, I'll be back next week with the second part of Peter and I's discussion, as well as probably something else that I'll cook up.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.